The human war machine continued its work for 3 months after the Krell surrendered, because momentum carries its own logic, and fleets already deployed complete their missions. And Commander Hajun's forces secured the last Krell military installations, while General Soman's Marines occupied fortress worlds that no longer had the will to fight. And across 40 star systems, human engineers arrived behind the combat troops to begin the strange work of helping rebuild the infrastructure they had systematically destroyed. And this paradox confused the galaxy, which had expected humans to either conquer or withdraw, but never imagined they would do both simultaneously. Earth's War Council met in Geneva, facing a question more difficult than any military objective: when to stop, and the debate lasted for weeks, with Hawks arguing that permanent occupation was necessary to prevent future threats, while others claimed that reducing the Krell to a client state would make humanity the very thing they had fought against. And Admiral Minho attended these sessions still wearing his uniform, but speaking against continued military operations, saying, "My people have been fighting for 18 months, and they've done everything we asked. They've defeated an empire. They've secured every objective, and now they want to come home." Continuing operations past this point serves politics, not security. Daehyun returned from the Vorlathi homeworld carrying Thessian's warning about the choice between defensive power and galactic empire, and he requested to address not just the War Council, but every human government simultaneously through the quantum communication network that connected all human worlds. And what he said in that address became the defining moment of post-war humanity. His words broadcast to 6 billion people across 17 systems, while Jiwoo stood beside him holding the documentation of everything Thessian had shown them. "We won," Daehyun said to an audience that stretched across light years. "We took a species that attacked us without provocation, and we dismantled their ability to wage war. We pursued them across 40 systems, we defeated every fleet they sent against us, and we proved to the galaxy that attacking humanity carries consequences that don't end at negotiation tables. But winning the war was the easy part. The hard part is what we do now, because the choices we make in the next few months will determine whether our children inherit a galaxy that respects us or a galaxy that fears us. And there is a profound difference between the two." He played recordings from Thessian Nova showing Thessian's explanation of humanity's nature, showing the futures where restraint led to more attacks and the futures where vengeance led to isolation, and he spoke about the responsibility that came with being the species that never stopped when attacked, saying the Vorlathi prophet saw thousands of possible futures, and in every one where we were attacked we responded with overwhelming force. But he also saw that we have a choice about what happens after victory. We can occupy Krell space and ensure they never rebuild. We can demand tribute and vassalage. We can become the empire that rules through fear, or we can help them rebuild under conditions that prevent future aggression, while allowing them dignity, and that second path is harder, but it's the only one that leads to lasting peace. The vote took place across all human governments simultaneously, with results aggregated through the quantum network, and the margin was narrow enough to make clear that humanity remained divided about its role in the galaxy, but the majority chose the harder path, chose to help rebuild while maintaining security, chose to demonstrate that human strength included the capacity for mercy, and Daehyun announced the decision to the Galactic Council with words carefully chosen to establish precedent. Humanity accepts the Krell surrender and will implement the following terms: complete demilitarization supervised by Council inspectors, reparations paid through labor in rebuilding what was destroyed, 50 years of monitored peace during which any military rebuilding will be met with immediate response, and human assistance in reconstructing civilian infrastructure to ensure stability. The Krell Imperator received these terms in his throne room that had stood for 1,000 years and had witnessed the rise and fall of his species' power, and he asked the human negotiator Min-Seok-yu why humanity offered help after taking everything. And Min-Seok's response became famous across both species. "Because stable, prosperous neighbors make better security than desperate, broken ones nursing grievances. We're not helping you from kindness, we're helping you from self-interest. But the result is the same, and maybe that's enough." Hana Shin arrived on the Krell throne world leading an economic team that shocked galactic observers by proposing investment rather than extraction, explaining to skeptical Krell officials that humanity's economy had been built on trade between human colonies, and that the same model could include Krell worlds if they demonstrated peaceful intent. and she showed them projections of mutual benefit that seemed impossible after 18 months of war. But the mathematics were sound, and the alternative was generations of occupation that nobody wanted. Former Marine Dongwook, MW, who had fought in the campaign to take Drak 9, returned to that world not as a conqueror, but as part of the reconstruction effort. And he worked alongside Krell engineers to rebuild defensive installations that would protect against natural disasters rather than invasions. And one day, a Krell veteran he had fought against asked why humans would help rebuild what they destroyed. And Dongwook replied, "Because the war is over and continuing to hate you serves no purpose. We fought because you attacked New Sol. We stopped when you surrendered. And now we rebuild because that's what civilized species do after war's end." The Galactic Council reconvened 6 months after the Krell surrender to address what they called the human question, because humanity's capacity for sustained warfare had fundamentally altered the galactic balance of power, and Ambassador Jiwoo, who had replaced the retired Daehyun, faced a chamber full of species who viewed humanity with a mixture of respect and fear, and she understood that every word she spoke would shape diplomatic relations for generations. So when the council chair asked what assurances humanity could provide that they wouldn't use their military power to dominate other species, her response established the framework that became known as the Thessian Doctrine. "Humanity will never strike first," Jiwoo said with the clarity that came from watching ideals be tested in fire. "We will not invade our neighbors. We will not demand tribute. We will not use our military strength to coerce trade agreements or political concessions. But if any species attacks human colonies or human citizens, our response will be immediate, overwhelming, and sustained until that species' capability to wage war is eliminated. And following that elimination, we will assist in rebuilding under terms that ensure the peace we fought for actually means something. This is not a threat. This is a promise. And the difference is that threats invite testing while promises invite trust." The council debated for weeks whether to accept the Thessian Doctrine as legitimate galactic policy, or whether it represented human exceptionalism that undermined collective security. And finally, the vote came down to a simple calculation. Accept that humanity operated under different rules, or attempt to enforce compliance knowing that enforcement might trigger the very response they feared. And pragmatism won over principle, as it usually did in politics. And the Thessian Doctrine became official policy, with the understanding that humanity was powerful enough to operate outside the rules, but wise enough to establish rules for itself young. Officer Seojin, now Captain Seojin O, commanded a vessel in the new Galactic Peace Fleet, a joint force created to respond to humanitarian crises and prevent the kind of aggression that had sparked the Human-Krell War. And his ship included crew members from 6 different species, including 3 Krell veterans who had fought against humanity and now served alongside humans. And the irony was not lost on anyone that the species which had demonstrated the most devastating military capacity now led efforts to prevent future wars. Correspondent Yoonji Cho stood on New Sol 5 years after the Krell attack, and the colony had been rebuilt with help from both human and Krell engineers, and the scars from kinetic bombardment remained visible as a deliberate memorial to what had been lost. But around those scars, new cities rose with architecture that blended human and Krell design principles. And she interviewed Sun Woo Han, who had returned as colonial administrator, overseeing the reconstruction. And he told her, "My daughter Minji was 7 when the Krell burned our home. And she's 12 now, and she plays with Krell children whose parents help maintain the same shield generators that failed to protect us. And sometimes I feel anger that her childhood includes these impossible contradictions. But mostly I feel hope that her generation won't have to learn what mine did about the cost of war." Admiral Minho retired after 35 years of military service and took a teaching position at Earth's War College, where he taught strategy to the next generation of officers. And his lectures emphasized when not to fight as much as how to fight, saying, "The Krell campaign proved that humanity can wage total war and win, but the peace that followed proved." Captain Hyun-woo stood in the observation gallery of Station Vertex and watched the council members argue below, their voices rising in 18 different languages as translation devices struggled to keep pace with the chaos. And he wondered not for the first time why humanity had fought so hard to earn a place among these bickering species who seemed more interested in protecting their own territories than facing the threat that loomed over all of them. The Krell Dominion had given them 3 days to respond to the ultimatum, and 2 of those days had already vanished into endless debates about jurisdiction and historical precedent and trade, agreements that nobody cared about when plasma cannons were pointed at their world's ambassador. G1 stood at the human delegation's podium and made another passionate plea for unity, her silver hair catching the light as she gestured toward the star maps showing Krell fleet movements. But half the council members weren't even paying attention anymore, too busy whispering to their aides or checking data tablets for messages from their home governments. Yun-Woo had seen this before on a smaller scale when pirates raided the outer colonies, and the local defense forces spent more time arguing about who should respond than actually responding. And by the time they agreed on a plan, his brother's transport ship was already debris floating in the black. He pushed that memory down deep, where it always lived, and focused on the present moment. Because dwelling on the past never saved anyone in the future. A deep rumbling sound rolled through the station's superstructure, and the council chamber fell silent as every species present recognized the sound of something very large moving through metal corridors, where nothing large should be the emergency. Alarms began screaming, and holographic displays flashed red warnings in every direction as a voice announced in calm, measured tones that containment breach had occurred in Vault 7 and all personnel should evacuate to designated safe zones. Immediately, Hyun-Woo didn't wait for orders, because his training kicked in automatically and he was already moving toward the exit where civilians would need guidance. And behind him he heard Ambassador Ji-won calling his name, but he was already gone. The corridors filled with panicking delegates and staff members running in every direction, while security forces in combat armor rushed past going the opposite way with weapons ready. And Hyun-Woo grabbed a young intern who was frozen in fear and pushed him toward the evacuation route before continuing forward against the tide of fleeing people. He reached an intersection where the corridor split 3 ways and had to make a choice between the route toward the evacuation pods and the route toward the screaming, and his feet carried him toward the screaming without consulting his brain first. The temperature dropped as he ran, and frost formed on the walls in patterns that looked almost like claw marks, and he could hear something massive moving just around the next corner, accompanied by a sound like grinding crystal that made his teeth ache. Hyun-Woo rounded the corner and stopped dead because the thing standing in the corridor was impossible. It stood twice as tall as a man, with 6 legs planted on the deck, plating, and a body covered in what looked like living crystal that shifted through colors he didn't have names for, and its head was somewhere between a wolf and something prehistoric, with teeth that glowed faintly in the emergency lighting. Security forces were scattered across the floor, alive but unconscious and covered in the same frost that coated every surface, and the creature stood among them like a monument to some ancient war that the galaxy had forgotten. The thing turned its massive head toward Hyun-Woo, and he saw intelligence in those eyes that was deeper and older than anything he'd encountered before, and he realized with absolute certainty that this was not an animal. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he stood his ground because running never solved anything, and because something in those ancient eyes looked tired and sad and lost. The creature took a step toward him, and the deck plates groaned under its weight, and Hyun-Woo raised his hand slowly to show he was unarmed, even though he knew weapons wouldn't help against something that had torn through military-grade containment. He opened his mouth and heard himself say words that surprised him because he hadn't planned them. "What do you want?" The creature stopped moving and tilted its head in a gesture that was so human it hurt. And for a long moment nothing happened except the sound of alarms and distant shouting and his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. Then the creature moved, faster than something that large should be able to move, and closed the distance between them in a single bound. And Hyun-Woo had exactly enough time to think that he'd made a terrible mistake before the creature's head touched his chest. The world exploded into sensation and memory and emotion that wasn't his own. He saw through different eyes across centuries of existence and felt the loneliness of being the last of a kind that once numbered in the thousands. And he experienced the crushing weight of being used as a weapon by species after species who never asked what he wanted or needed or felt. The creature's name was Wraith, and he was so tired of being a tool. Images flashed through Hyun-Woo's mind of the species who created the Vornak war beasts and bred them to be the ultimate weapons, and he saw how those creators had fallen to dust while their living weapons survived and suffered. Through the ages, Wraith had been searching for something across the centuries and through dozens of species who tried to control him, and that something was a partner who would see him as a person rather than a possession. The bond formed between them like a bridge built in an instant, and Hyunwoo gasped as new senses flooded his awareness, and he could feel Wraith's emotions as clearly as his own and knew without words that the war beast had chosen him. He didn't know why or what made him different from all the others who had tried and failed to earn Wraith's trust. But the choice had been made and couldn't be unmade. Wraith pulled back and Hyunwoo staggered but stayed on his feet, and the massive creature sat down in front of him like a dog, waiting for its person to come home. The security forces arrived with heavy weapons and found Captain Hyunwoo standing calmly next to the most dangerous being in known space, and the war beast that had terrorized the station was now sitting peacefully, as if it had never been a threat at all. Ambassador Ji-won pushed through the security cordon and stopped when she saw them, and her face went through several expressions, in rapid succession, before settling on something. Between awe and absolute terror, the council would have questions, and humanity's position in galactic politics had just become infinitely more complicated. But in that moment, Hyunwoo felt something he hadn't felt since his brother died. He felt like he had a purpose again. Wraith made a sound deep in his chest that might have been contentment or might have been relief. And through their new connection, Hyunwoo understood that the war beast had been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be chosen back. The galaxy would hold its breath, because a human had bonded with a living legend, but neither Hyunwoo nor Wraith cared much about the galaxy's opinion. They had found each other in a corridor filled with frost and fear, and sometimes that was enough. The news traveled faster than light across the communication networks that connected the galaxy, and within 6 hours every government and military force knew that a human had bonded with Wraith, the ancient war beast, and the reactions ranged from disbelief to fury to cold calculating fear. Warlord Tharix received the report in his command chamber aboard the flagship Devastation and immediately understood that his careful invasion timeline had just become worthless, because the one weapon that could counter Krell's superiority was now in play and bonded to a species that barely understood interstellar politics. He moved up the attack schedule and dispatched 3 battle groups to hit the border systems before the council could organize any defense, and his orders were simple and brutal because mercy was a concept that Krell had abandoned generations ago. Hyunwoo woke up screaming from dreams that weren't his and found Wraith's massive head resting on the floor next to his bed. And through their bond he felt the war beast's concern, mixed with old memories of other bonded partners who couldn't handle the mental strain. Dr. Bora arrived at his quarters on Station Vertex before breakfast and didn't wait for an invitation before walking in with her data tablets and scanning equipment. And she was the kind of scientist who viewed sleep as optional when there was interesting research to be done. She spent 2 hours running tests and asking questions while Hyunwoo tried to explain what the bond felt like, and words kept failing him because how do you describe sharing thoughts with a being that had lived for centuries? The bond wasn't like talking or reading minds, but more like standing in the same room with someone and knowing their mood without them saying anything, except the room was his entire consciousness, and Wraith was always there in the background. Like a second heartbeat, Bora finally sat back and pulled off her reading glasses to clean them, which meant she was organizing her thoughts. And when she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. You're adapting faster than you should be, and that's probably because Wraith is being careful not to overwhelm you. But eventually you'll need to access the full depth of the bond if you want to fight alongside him. And that's going to hurt. Before Hyunwoo could respond, the emergency alarms began wailing again, and Ambassador Ji-won's face appeared on every screen in the room with news that the Krell had attacked New Jeju Colony without warning. The council was still debating their response when Commander Dae-jung contacted Hyunwoo directly on a private channel and asked a simple question. Are you ready to find out what you and that beast can really do? Hyunwoo looked at Wraith and felt the war beast's eagerness mixed with concern for him, and he realized that this was the moment when everything would change, because sitting safely on a station while people died wasn't something either of them could accept. They reached the human dreadnought Indomitable 4 hours later, and Dae-jung met them in the hangar bay where crew members stopped working to stare at Wraith, and the war beast ignored them all except for one young mechanic who offered him a respectful nod, which Wraith returned. The fleet that assembled to defend New Jeju was smaller than it should have been because most council species were still arguing about jurisdiction. But humanity's ships came and they brought their allies who remembered favors owed and debts unpaid. Hyunwoo stood on the bridge next to his old commander and watched the tactical displays show. Krell ships in orbit bombarding the colony below, and rage filled him so completely that it took a moment to realize half of it was coming through the bond from Wraith. The war beast was in a specially modified cargo bay that had been converted into a deployment chamber, and through their connection, Hyunwoo could feel Wraith testing the restraints, not because he wanted to escape but because he needed to know they would release quickly enough. Indomitable dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, and Daejung gave the order to advance, and 12 human ships along with vessels from 6 allied species accelerated toward a Krell force that outnumbered them 3-1. Hyunwoo closed his eyes and opened himself fully to the bond for the first time, and the rush of information nearly knocked him off his feet as centuries of combat experience flooded into his awareness. He could see the battle the way Wraith saw it, with patterns and probabilities, and weak points that his human brain would never have noticed alone. And when he opened his mouth, tactical suggestions came out in his voice, but with knowledge that wasn't his. Daejung listened and began giving orders based on Hyunwoo's insights, and the bridge crew worked with practiced efficiency to execute maneuvers that shouldn't have worked but did because Wraith understood how Krell commanders thought. The fleet hit the Krell forces like a hammer, strike to the weak point of an anvil, and scattered their formation. And in the chaos, Hyunwoo gave the order to launch Wraith's deployment pod. The warbeast fell toward the planet in a capsule designed to survive atmospheric entry, and Hyunwoo felt every second of the drop through their bond while simultaneously coordinating fleet movements that kept the Krell ships too busy to shoot down. The pod Wraith hit the ground near the main colony settlement where Krell shock troops were advancing through the streets, and the deployment pod exploded outward in a shower of metal fragments that cleared a landing zone. What happened next would be recorded in military databases across the galaxy and studied for generations. Wraith moved through the Krell ground forces like a natural disaster that had learned to hunt, and his crystal armor shrugged off weapons fire while his claws tore through combat exoskeletons like they were made of paper. Hyunwoo guided him through the colony layout using orbital maps, while Wraith provided the combat instincts that kept them both alive. And together they were something that hadn't existed in the galaxy for thousands of years, a true war beast partnership operating at full capacity. The Krell forces broke after 20 minutes of watching their elite troops fall to a single opponent, and their commanders ordered a retreat to orbit, which became a rout when Daejung pressed the attack. A fleet battle ended 3 hours later with Krell ships jumping away to faster-than-light travel and leaving behind their ground forces to surrender, and it was the first major Krell defeat anyone could remember. Hyunwoo collapsed on the bridge and didn't wake up for 18 hours. When consciousness finally returned, he found himself in the medical bay with Bora standing over him, looking worried and triumphant at the same time, and she told him that he'd nearly burned out his neural pathways by pushing the bond too hard too fast. Wraith was there too, lying on the floor next to the medical bed because nobody had been brave enough to make him leave. And through their connection, Hyunwoo felt the war beast's relief mixed with guilt. Bora explained that they needed to train properly before attempting anything like that again, or the next time might kill him. And Hyunwoo agreed because dying wasn't part of the plan, but as he lay there recovering, he couldn't help but feel satisfied because they'd saved New Jeju and proven that humanity deserved its place among the stars. And maybe that was worth the risk. Wraith made that rumbling sound again and sent a feeling through the bond that translated roughly to agreement mixed with affection. And Hyunwoo realized that somewhere between the battle and the collapse, he'd stopped thinking of the warbeast as a partner and started thinking of him as a friend. The galaxy had seen what they could do, and the Krell now knew fear. But more importantly, Hyunwoo had discovered that the bond wasn't just about fighting, it was about trust. Elder Torvik arrived at Station Vertex 3 days after the Battle of New Jeju, and brought with him documents that were older than most species' recorded histories. And when he requested a private meeting with Hyunwoo and Wraith, the station's security forces weren't sure whether to allow it until Ambassador Ji-won personally vouched for him. The Elder was a Primarch descendant, which meant his people had once ruled half the galaxy before their civilization collapsed under its own weight, and he moved slowly with the care of someone whose body had outlived several natural lifespans. Through medical intervention, he sat across from Hyunwoo in a conference room while Wraith lay nearby and spread ancient star charts across the table with hands that trembled slightly. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of knowledge that he'd been keeping secret for decades. The Vornak war beasts were not merely bred for combat, but designed as living keys to access weapon systems that the Primarchs built throughout the galaxy. And these weapons could destroy entire solar systems if activated. Hyunwoo felt his blood turn cold while Wraith remained perfectly still, in a way that suggested the war beast had known this truth all along. Torvik explained that the Primarchs had scattered these installations across dozens of systems and locked them behind genetic codes that only bonded war beasts could access. And the reason Wraith had avoided bonding for so long was because every previous partner had eventually discovered this secret and tried to use the weapons for conquest through their bond. Hyunwoo felt Wraith's ancient shame and fear, and he understood that the war beast had been running from this knowledge for centuries while watching species after species prove themselves unworthy of the power. The Elder pulled up holographic images of massive structures hidden in deep space and buried on forgotten worlds, and he warned that the Krell intelligence network was thorough enough that they would discover this information eventually, if they hadn't already. Hyunwoo asked the question that mattered most, which was whether these weapons could be destroyed. And Torvik's silence was answer enough. The installations were built to survive anything short of a star-going supernova, and attempting to destroy them would likely trigger automatic defenses that would kill billions. So the only real option was to ensure they remained locked forever. Lieutenant Yuna knocked on the conference room door and entered with her usual efficiency. And she'd been assigned as Hyunwoo's aide after the battle, because someone needed to manage the flood of requests and demands that came with bonding to a legend. She carried a data tablet with urgent messages, and her expression suggested that something had gone wrong. And when she spoke, her voice was tight with controlled anger. The silent chorus had just attempted to assassinate Hyunwoo by poisoning his food in the officer's mess, and only the quick action of the kitchen staff who noticed something wrong had prevented the attack. Security had arrested 3 suspects, but they'd killed themselves before questioning. An investigation showed they were part of an ancient organization that believed no single being should ever control a war beast. Hyunwoo realized that he'd become a target not just for the Krell but for elements within the council itself, who saw him as a threat to the balance of power, and the knowledge of the weapon installations would make everything worse. Wraith growled low in his chest, and Hyunwoo felt protective rage flowing through the bond, but he pushed calm back in return because violence wouldn't solve this problem. That night, while reviewing security footage of the assassination attempt, Yuna stayed late in his office going through files, and she'd proven herself to be more than just efficient but genuinely committed to keeping him alive. She asked him directly whether he'd ever considered using the ancient weapons if the situation became desperate enough, and Hyunwoo appreciated her honesty because most people danced around uncomfortable questions. He told her the truth, which was that the thought had crossed his mind during the battle when Krell ships were bombarding civilian centers, but actually using weapons of mass destruction would make him exactly what his enemies claimed he was. Yuna nodded and went back to work, and Hyunwoo felt grateful for people who asked hard questions without judging the person struggling with the answers. The Krell made their move 2 weeks later, when intelligence reports showed them mobilizing resources toward tracking down the Primarch installations, and Warlord Theric sent a message directly to Hyunwoo offering an alliance. The message was simple and brutal in its logic, which suggested the Krell commander understood psychology better than most people gave him credit for. Join us and use the ancient weapons to subjugate the Council, species who will never truly accept humanity, or refuse and watch as we capture Wraith and extract the access codes through forced neural dissection. Hyunwoo read the message 3 times and felt Wraith's concern through their bond. And the war beast sent images of previous partners who'd been tempted by similar offers and what they'd become after accepting. Called an emergency meeting with Ambassador Ji-won and Commander Dae-jung and several other officers he trusted, and they spent 6 hours debating options that all seemed to lead to disaster. Ji-won argued for going public with the information and trusting the Council to find a solution, while Dae-jung wanted to launch preemptive strikes against Krell intelligence facilities before they could locate the installations. Hyunwoo listened to everyone and then made a decision that surprised them all. He would broadcast a message across every communication channel in the galaxy and reveal the truth about the ancient weapons himself. And he would publicly swear an oath never to use them regardless of circumstances. The room erupted in protests because exposing the secret would paint a target on his back that could never be removed. But Hyunwoo had already made up his mind. He recorded the message in an empty briefing room with only Wraith present, and he spoke directly to the camera with the kind of honesty that politicians and military officers usually avoided. He explained what the Vornak war beasts really were and what power they could access, and he stated clearly that he would never use those weapons even if it meant defeat. Then he did something that made Bo-Ra call him insane when she heard about it later. He opened the bond fully and allowed Wraith to enforce the oath at a level that would kill him instantly if he ever tried to break it. And the war beast accepted without hesitation because they trusted each other completely. The message broadcast across the galaxy and reactions came in within hours. Some species praised his transparency, while others condemned him for revealing secrets that should have stayed hidden. And the Krell sent a second message calling him a fool, who just made himself obsolete. But something unexpected happened in the weeks that followed. The silent chorus ceased there. Attacks because Hyunwoo had proven he wasn't seeking power, and several neutral species who'd been watching humanity with suspicion began to reconsider their positions. Ambassador Ji-won was furious at first, but gradually came to understand that her captain had done something radical, which was choosing trust over power in a galaxy built on cynicism. Yuna took a blade, meant for Hyunwoo, when a lone assassin who hadn't gotten the message tried to finish the job, and she survived but would carry the scar forever. Hyunwoo sat by her hospital bed and promised that her sacrifice wouldn't be wasted, and through the bond, Wraith sent determination mixed with gratitude for humans who protected their own. The galaxy now knew the truth, and the Krell accelerated their invasion plans. But Hyunwoo had made his choice and would live or die by it. Sometimes the only way forward was radical honesty, even when honesty felt like suicide. The Krell Armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Vertex system, with 3,000 warships arranged in formations that had crushed 100 civilizations, and Warlord Therex broadcast his ultimatum on all frequencies so every species in the galaxy could hear surrender. The human and his warbeast within 12 hours, or Station Vertex would be reduced to debris, and every ship that tried to defend it would be destroyed. Admiral Tae Yang stood in the command center of the defense fleet and looked at the tactical display, showing 800 Allied ships against overwhelming odds, and his weathered face showed no emotion as he began organizing defensive formations. The council convened an emergency session, and the debate lasted only 40 minutes before the vote came, and 23 species voted to surrender Hyunwoo and Wraith to save the station, while 17 voted to refuse humanity. His delegation walked out of the chamber, followed by the delegations from 6 other species who'd fought alongside human forces in previous conflicts. And Ambassador Ji-won's final words to the council were simple. History will remember who stood firm and who Nel Tae-yang had been skeptical of Hyunwoo when the young captain first arrived with his war beast companion. But watching someone refuse to bow under pressure earned respect that couldn't be bought or manufactured. Invited Hyunwoo to the strategy room and asked for tactical input, without any of the condescension that older officers usually showed younger ones. And together they began planning a defense that might last long, enough for evacuation ships to get civilians to safety. The plan was desperate and relied on drawing the Krell fleet into close quarters, around the station where superior numbers mattered less. And while the defense fleet fought, Hyunwoo and Wraith would lead a strike team to board Therex's flagship. Bo-Ra called the plan suicide with extra steps, but she still helped outfit a stealth shuttle with equipment that might get them close enough to the Krell command ship before detection, and her hands shook while she worked because she'd lost too many colleagues already. The Krell fleet advanced on schedule, and their vanguard opened fire at extreme range, and plasma bolts began hammering Station Vertex's shields while point defense systems tried to intercept the incoming fire. Tae-yang's fleet met them head-on in a coordinated strike that broke the Krell vanguard formation and forced them to commit more ships than they'd planned. And the battle became a swirling chaos of explosions and debris that made tactical displays nearly useless. Aside, Station Vertex civilians evacuated through emergency portals, while security forces set up defensive positions at key junctions. And somewhere in the chaos, Krell infiltration teams breached the hull and began hunting for Wraith. Lieutenant Yuna was supposed to be on an evacuation ship, but she'd stayed behind to coordinate civilian resistance. And when Krell commandos reached Junction 7, near the residential sections, she was there with a rifle she barely knew how to use. The infiltrators were elite troops in powered armor with weapons designed to punch through military shields, and they moved through the corridors with the confidence of soldiers who'd never been stopped before. They met Yuna and a group of civilians who refused to run, and the firefight that followed would be remembered as one of the most desperate last stands in station history. Yuna took 3 hits that her light armor mostly absorbed and kept firing until her rifle overheated, and when a Krell commando grabbed her, she pulled a plasma grenade from her belt and triggered it at point-blank range. The explosion killed the commando and wounded 2 others. But Yuna survived because she'd timed the detonation perfectly, and reinforcements arrived seconds later to find her unconscious but alive among the wreckage. Priest warrior Malik and his order held Junction 7 with traditional bladed weapons that seemed absurd against modern firearms, and the Anthar warrior moved with practiced precision that came from a lifetime of combat training. His people believed Hyunwoo was prophesied in their ancient texts as the beast speaker who would unite the galaxy against darkness, and whether the prophecy was real or interpreted to fit current events didn't matter, because Malik believed completely. He and his warriors bought time for thousands of civilians to evacuate, and they paid for every second with blood. And when the battle was over, only 3 of the 12 warriors remained standing. Hyunwoo and Wraith launched from Station Vertex while the siege raged around them, and the stealth shuttle slipped through the battle using debris fields as cover, and Bora's modifications worked better than she'd promised. They approached the Krell flagship from below, where its sensors had blind spots, and Wraith used his crystal armor to cut through the hull while Hyunwoo sealed the breach behind them. The ship's interior was a maze of corridors designed for species larger than humans, but Wraith moved through them like he'd been born there, and through their bond, Hyunwoo understood that war beasts had boarded countless ships across the centuries. They fought through deck after deck with Wraith handling combat while Hyunwoo managed their route, and the bond between them had grown so deep that they moved as one organism with 2 bodies. Krell security forces tried to stop them with everything from plasma rifles to electromagnetic nets, and each attempt failed because Hyunwoo and Wraith had learned to anticipate and counter together. They reached the command deck and found Warlord Therix waiting with his personal guard, and the Krell commander was easily 3 times Hyunwoo's mass with cybernetic enhancements that turned him into a weapon. Therix dismissed his guards with a gesture and spoke to Hyunwoo in surprisingly fluent human standard language. You've impressed me enough that I'll make the offer one final time. Join the Dominion and rule as equals or die here and achieve nothing. Hyunwoo felt Wraith's uncertainty through the bond and understood why, because the war beast had seen the Council's flaws and knew how many species would happily sacrifice humanity to save themselves. For a moment he considered it because the Krell offered something simple, which was strength respected and rewarded, and the Council offered only complicated politics and conditional acceptance. Then he thought about Yuna taking a blade for him, and Jiwon fighting impossible political battles, and Daejung trusting him with command, and Malik believing in prophecies that gave people hope. He thought about his brother who died because no one acted fast enough, and all the people on Station Vertex who were fighting right now because they believed cooperation was worth defending. He told Therix no, the fight that followed was brutal and personal, because Therix was a warrior who'd killed hundreds in single combat, and his weapons had ended lives across a dozen species. But Hyunwoo and Wraith were something new, which was a perfect partnership between 2 beings who trusted each other completely, and that made them stronger than the sum of their parts. They moved around Therix's attacks and struck back with coordinated precision, and slowly the Krell commander began to realize he was fighting something he couldn't beat alone. The battle ended when Wraith pinned Therix against the command console, and Hyunwoo held a plasma cutter to the flagship's reactor controls. He gave Therix a choice, which was order the retreat or watch his entire fleet die when the reactor detonated. The Krell commander stared at him for a long moment and then began laughing, and he issued the retreat order while complimenting Hyunwoo's tactics. The Krell armada withdrew from the Vertex system and left behind their ground forces to whatever fate awaited them, and Admiral Tae Yang couldn't quite believe they'd survived. Hyunwoo collapsed on the shuttle ride back to Station Vertex and woke up 3 days later in medical with Wraith standing guard, and the war beast sent relief and pride through their bond. They'd proven themselves, but the cost had been high, and the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. Sometimes surviving was the same as winning.